Was heute Werk ist eine Fahrt gemacht. Wie die Korken haben.
Hi folks, and welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video we're going to be building the wonderful Copper State Models 1/35 scale Wanderer motorcycle, paired with the accompanying Werner Voss figure. This kit was a gift from a good friend of mine, Rico, and I really appreciate it. So thanks Rico, I hope I do it justice. So this small motorbike is one of Copper State Models' latest releases, and unlike their usual kits, it's 3D printed as opposed to styrene. The instructions are really straightforward, and there are only several steps to follow, and surprisingly for the complexity of this model, there are very few parts. There are markings for 4 different versions of this vehicle, all decked out in the same pale green camouflage colour. But if you want to get creative, there are many civilian variants that you could paint. The small decal sheet is provided by Cartograph, and as you'd expect, is nicely done. The parts on this kit are excellently printed. The print is crisp and really detailed. The parts seem delicate, but they're actually fairly sturdy. I did spend a lot of the build worrying I was going to break off some of the parts. Now, there are a few visible layer lines, but they are very minor, so some sanding or some thick layers of paint will go away to covering some of those up. Considering this model is spread out over only 8 parts, it's quite simply astonishing. But then I am partial to a good 3D print. The figure again is 3D printed, and the sculpt is really nice, and it really matches Werner Voss's likeness. They've captured the pose from the famous photo I shared in the intro perfectly. And everything is nicely crisp. This is going to be really fun to paint. So 2 minutes in and we haven't done any modelling yet. Let's change that. Let's get on with the build. As the parts already came pre-cleaned, there was very little cleanup to do. So it was pretty much a case of getting straight into the construction. For the initial stages of construction, everything was glued together with VMS black superglue. And to make painting easier, I left the model in a few sub-assemblies, but I did glue some parts together to make them easier to handle. You'll notice how slowly I'm putting these parts together, and that's because I was really worried about breaking them. But during the whole build I only had one breakage, and that was near the end. I had to add 2 pieces of 0.2mm wire to fix some of the control cables. These must have been damaged in shipping. And after that was done, I primed the entire motorbike with MRP Fine Surface Primer Black. For the first bit of paint on this motorbike, I used some MRP burnt iron mixed with black. This was used to spray the piston housings on the engine. I then followed this with some magnesium to paint the engine block. For all my spraying on this bike, because I need utmost precision, I'm using my Harder & Steenbeck 0.15 Infinity CR. I didn't have any solid references on the colour for this bike, so I guesstimated up a field grey mixed from MRP Interior Grey Green, Dark Green and RAF Marking Blue. I think this will be close enough. Now because this model is tiny, it's going to be a real challenge to do any black basing, so I pretty much went for a solid, consistent build-up of colour. I also had to be really careful when painting around the engine. As I'm much too lazy to mask off such intricate work, I decided to make things harder for myself and freehand it. But in the end, some careful spraying and limited trigger was enough to do the job. With the main colour down, it was time to start work on some of those layer lines. To help tidy these up, I used a very small piece of Infini sanding sponge, slightly moistened with water. This was very lightly used to abrade away some of those layer lines. Some were sadly almost impossible to reach, so I did have to make a few compromises. But considering the size of this vehicle and the average viewing distance, I don't think anybody who sees it in person is going to notice. But I did do my best to try and get rid of the ones I could reach. These areas were then resprayed with the base colour. I did cave and mask off some areas for spraying. For the bigger metallic areas, like the pedals, I didn't want to have to lean on brush painted metallics, so these were carefully masked off and sprayed with Alclad. Now, because of the finesse of most of the details and the difficulty to reach of a lot of the parts, the rest of this model is going to be brush painted, and there are a lot of details to paint. First up, I painted the tyres in using AK 3rd Gen Smoke Black mixed with a touch of flesh, just to make them a bit more grey. Areas that were going to be brush painted metallics were given an undercoat of a light colour to make the metallics pop. For this I'm using a Vallejo off-white colour. To start, the horn was based in a coat of Darkstar Fine Gold. I then added some shading with Darkstar Regency Gold. This was finished off with some highlights of rich gold mixed with tarnished steel. The white areas of the number plate are provided as a decal, so for the lettering and the black edging to show through, I needed to paint the number plate holder black. For this I used some AK 3rd Gen black. I then popped on the front number plate decal. Firstly, I put down a light layer of VMS decal set and fix. Then the decal was carefully slid into place. When the decal was dry, this was finished with some VMS decal softener. With all the decals applied to the model, I gave the entire bike, apart from the engine, a coat of VMS satin varnish. I then moved on to painting some more of the small details on the bike. Most of the metallics again on this were done with Darkstar metallics, although I did use one or two Citadel colours. And all the other details were either picked out with Vallejo or AK 3rd Gen paints. Here I'm using Darkstar Regency Gold to pick out these tiny details. This handle was painted with a mix of Darkstar pewter and tarnished steel. And I then began to pick out some of the pipework with AK 3rd Gen black. I spruced up the engine with some metallic colours, as there were some details that needed to be picked out. The chain was picked out with Darkstar pewter. And the drive belt was initially painted with German camouflage black brown. I later went over this with a very dark black grey. The heat shield for the exhaust pipe was sprayed with Alclad aluminium. I didn't need this to be particularly shiny, so I sprayed it straight onto the resin. This was then carefully glued into place with standard VMS Flexi 5K CA. This was probably the trickiest part of the whole build. It did take a little while to get the part into the correct position. To add some initial staining to the exhaust, I mixed up some raw umber Liquitex acrylic ink with some Darkstar tarnished steel. This was then stippled and wet blended over the exhaust pipe to start off the heat staining process. I'll return to this area with oil paints later on. Even though on the reference pictures I've seen, the manufacturer logos on these bikes were painted with the body colour, I wanted to make life harder for myself and paint them up to the same colours seen on the civilian versions. So with a steady hand and a little frustration, I brush painted these in. And while they didn't come out absolutely perfect, they are minuscule, so I think it'll be close enough. I then added in some artificial highlights very lightly, with a mix of acrylics that was close to but lighter than the original base colour. For these raised details, I found it ideal to use the flat side of the brush instead of the point. Next up, it was time to add some chipping, and for this I used Vallejo German Camouflage Black Brown. This was mixed with a small amount of water and some VMS slow drying medium. This helps to stop the paint drying on the tip of the brush. The chipping patterns were focused on the areas that I thought would get the most wear. And the fenders were a good contender for that. And with the bulk of the detail painting complete, it was time to start on with some oil weathering. The main oil colours I'm going to be using are Abteilung 502 Starship Filth, Shadow Brown, Field Grey, and, not seen here, Buff. I'm going to start by mixing up a darker version of the base colour to use as a detail wash. Starship Filth and Field Grey are perfect for this. I'll save the Shadow Brown for the deeper shadows. Because this dark green mix wasn't too dissimilar from the base colour, I pretty much used this as an all-over wash over all of the green areas, just to add a bit more contrast. Then, using Starship Filth, I started to block in some shadow areas that I'd use for some light modulation. This was then blended in and smoothed with a soft, dry sable brush. This step usually takes a little work, but we get there in the end. Once the dark areas were complete, I added in some light highlights with Abteilung 502 Buff. Following the same principles as before, just using a little less paint. I then used a lighter version of the base coat mixed from oils to add some more subtle highlights to areas where I couldn't really do any blending. To the piston housings, I added a light dusty wash mixed from Abteilung 502, Buff and Shadow Brown. This was followed by a dark wash applied to the metallic areas of the engine. This was Abteilung 502, Shadow Brown mixed with engine grease. I added some tiny spots of Abteilung's oxide patina to the heat shield and the exhaust pipe. These were then gently blended in. And finally for the motorbike, I added some light dust using some VMS Brown Earth Pigment Jockey mixed with some fine sand pigment. This was thoroughly mixed and then fairly heavily thinned, before being brushed over the areas of the bike that were most likely to accumulate some dust. Because of the size of this vehicle, with all of these weathering techniques, subtlety was absolute key. I felt that if I applied too much weathering, the entire vehicle would look a bit silly, even if it was realistic. Plus, I didn't want to hide all of that lovely detail. And with that final bit of dusty weathering, it was time to glue the front wheel onto the body of the bike and call the bike done. But fear not, this video is not yet over. We've got a bit more work to do before we finish up this project. So let's get cracking. It's time to tackle the figure, Mr. Werner Voss himself. Let's take a look firstly at a few of the colours we're going to be using. For the uniform and his general outfit, I'm going to be using AK 3rd Gen's Black, Extra Dark Green, Field Grey, Grey version, and Field Grey, Green version, alongside Vallejo's Medium Flesh Tone and Light Flesh. These will be mainly used on the field jacket. For the flesh tones on the figure, I used Vallejo Hull Red, Cork Brown, Medium Flesh, Pale Flesh and Off-White. I also had to hand Dark Vermilion, Violet Red and Dark Prussian Blue, just in case I needed to add any tints or extra colours to the flesh. To start the figure, I'm going to roughly block in some of the main colours before I start any detail painting. I based the jacket with a mix of the AK 3rd Gen Field Grey colours. I mixed about 1:1 of the green and the grey versions. I used purely the grey version to block in the trousers, an off-white for the socks, a red-brown for the boots, and a mix of Hull Red and Cork Brown to base the flesh. And as I like to start with the face, we're going to start the detail painting with the face. First up, the eye whites were picked out with Vallejo Green Grey, before adding a blue iris. This was done with Vallejo's Dark Prussian Blue. I added a slight drop of lightened blue to the centre of the iris. I then added a tiny pupil and a catchlight, but that was almost impossible to film. So this is how the eyes ended up looking. Using Vallejo's medium flesh mixed with light flesh, I started to block in some of the highlights. I'm finally learning now not to forget the ears when painting the main flesh. I then added some more light flesh to my mix and started pushing those highlights further. And the process was repeated again with yet another lighter mix. With every lighter mix, I'm focusing on a smaller area each time. I then levelled out the shadow areas with a few layers of Hull Red Cork Brown mixed with medium flesh, before adding yet more highlights. And with a layer of matte varnish, the face was complete. I'm getting a lot better at faces and figure painting in general, and I'm really pleased with my progress, and it just goes to show that practice does pay off. I've still got a way to come, but I'm really happy with that. Let's crack on with the rest of the figure. For the field grey jacket, I used the colours referenced earlier, and mixed up a range of shades from dark to light. I'm sorry I didn't do this for the flesh tones, but I will try to show this process more in future figure videos. Using the technique I used on my Lancer figure, I started building up the highlights with short textural strokes. Once the first stage of highlights were complete, it was time to start introducing some shadows. To finish off the field jacket, the entire jacket was given a glaze of a mix of both of the field greys just to bring everything together. Let's quickly run over the colours I used for the trousers. Used AK 3rd Gen Smoke Black, Vallejo Dark Prussian Blue, AK Field Grey Grey Uniform, Vallejo Field Blue, Vallejo Grey White and Vallejo German Camouflage Beige. I then mixed up a selection of shades from dark to light to make these grey trousers come to life. The midtones were made up from bluey greys, and in the highlights I introduced some of the German Camouflage Beige for warmth. And in the shadows I leaned on the cool tones of the Smoke Black and Dark Prussian Blue. I started again by blocking in the highlights. Because I believed the trousers were made from a smoother material, I didn't go as textural with my strokes. But I still did add some hatching in there for some variation and interest. Then the shadows were brushed in with some very thin paint and some careful blending. This was done with several thin layers to build up to opacity. One of the challenges on this figures for me were the pinstripes on the trousers. In the reference image they're clearly visible, so I wanted them to match and look as good as I could make them. I built these up with a few light layers of carefully brushed Smoke Black. I don't think they're perfect, but I think they came out okay. Let's move on to the socks. These were first highlighted with some cool whites. Some dirty grey shadows were then added. I then brought out some of the texture with some washes and light dry brushing. The closest match to these socks I could find online were lederhosen socks, so I painted in some vertical stripes to give a knitted woolen impression, and painted the band around the top of the sock with dark Prussian blue mixed with Smoke Black with a cool white band brushed around the centre. I tried to match these tones as best as I could against the reference photo. The slight texture on the socks, which does look great, didn't help with the crisp lines I wanted for these bits, but I think I got there in the end. And lastly for the boots, I used a mix of Smoke Black, German Sea Black Brown, Red Brown and Medium Flesh. A mix of German Sea Black Brown and Red Brown were used for the body of the boots. German Sea Black Brown and Smoke Black were brushed in for the shadows, and Medium Flesh added to Red Brown was used for the highlights. I then had some buttons, piping and other details to paint, and all these were based with an off-white grey colour. The piping was painted with Vallejo Dark Vermilion mixed with a touch of Hull Red. And the buttons and brass details were picked out with Dark Star Regency Gold. polymerit was then picked out with some blue, and the head was glued in place. With the figure complete and the motorbike, let's put them on a small base. I made up a small rectangular base on Fusion 360, with the name of the bike on the back and Werner Voss's name on the front. This was then printed out on my Anycubic Mono M7 Pro, cleaned up and then sprayed black. I built this up with several layers of painting and several layers of sanding until it was smooth. Initially I was going to go for a gloss black finish, but I felt it detracted from the model and ended up settling on a nice, slick, matte varnish. And of course the varnish I used was VMS Matte Varnish HD. For the body of the base, I'm going to use a few VMS products and some plaster. So I'm going to use these diorama textures, desert sand and stones and yellow gravel, alongside some fine and coarse EU brown earth and some sand pigments. These were all mixed together in a plastic mixing cup. Everything was then combined to make sure it was mixed thoroughly together. I then added a healthy dollop of PVA glue to help everything stick together, and some water to activate the mix. Once everything was mixed together and combined, the mixture was dolloped onto the base. And the lovely mixture was then spread around with an old tatty brush. I then sprinkled on some more gravel and stones, and then gently patted and tapped these into the surface. To match the reference photo, I then stuck in place some tiny grass tufts from AK. To add a little more variation, I sprayed over some MLP earth colours. I then dabbed on some pigments for some more variation. These were sealed onto the base by adding a few drops of Universal Weathering Carrier Light. Our bike and figure, now attached together, were then attached to the base with some VMS Flexi Superglue. And once they were stuck down, our build was complete. Before we get to those final gallery images, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreon supporters. Your support is much appreciated. And I'd like to say thanks again to Rico for sending me this kit. I really enjoyed building this. It had minimal parts, it didn't take too long, and it was amazingly detailed, and the subject matter was right up my street. But I want to know what you think. How do you think I did? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you liked the video, don't forget to give it a like. Anyway, I'll leave you with the gallery images of what I think is one of my best models to date. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.